Missouri hides more than it reveals. On the surface, it is farm country and rolling timber, rivers that shine like melted glass, small towns stitched together by two-lane roads. But if you listen closely, the land hums. It is an old sound, older than borders and highway signs, a vibration that rises from bedrock and rumor alike. Beneath corn rows and courthouse squares, beneath the granite domes and the limestone bluffs, there is a second Missouri quiet, half-buried, stubbornly alive. Here, stone holds messages we still can't read. Rivers keep the secrets of the dead, and the ground occasionally returns bones that do not fit the story we have been telling. Step off the map for a moment. Follow me to a sandstone terrace above a slow, brown river, where carvings ripple under your fingertips as if the rock learned to breathe. Spirals, thunderbirds, human feet frozen mid-step, not decoration, not idle scratching, but a language that refuses to translate. Then turn south and west into the Ozarks, where legends of lost mines cling to the hollows like morning fog. They say the veins run silver in there, tucked behind brick mouths and collapsed shafts, traced not just by prospectors and dreamers, but by older hands who knew the taste of ore long before Europeans ever drew these hills in their ledgers. If a river can remember, the Osage does. It curls through the center of the state, like a thought you can't shake, uncovering fragments when the water runs low, a pipe worn smooth by a lip that has been dust for centuries, a figurine whose eyes still search the bank, a mound cut by the plow that once held a ceremony intact. Some of what the river reveals looks familiar: arrowheads, sherds, domestic tools, and some of it does not. Mixed designs and borrowed motifs hint at passing cultures, layered the way silt settles after a flood. The artifact with no context is a dangerous kind of mystery. It invites the wrong story and punishes the right one for not being loud enough. Drive on toward Gasconade County, where the ridges lift and the rumor grows taller. In the 1800s, while fields were cleared and barns raised, the ground gave up shapes that made newspapers frantic and skeptics patient. Skulls big enough to cradle a man's head, rib cages like barrels, burials arranged as if someone meant to be found and was not. Maybe it was error and exaggeration, a frontier's knack for telling everything larger, or maybe there were a few facts buried in the thunder of those headlines, misread, misplaced, and finally misfiled. In any case, the county still whispers, because whispers have a way of outliving the proof that made them. Swing east to Iron County, where Elephant Rocks draws weekend hikers to pink granite the size of houses. Families pose with the herd, then wander back to their cars, never knowing that a short climb away the hilltop changes its voice. Up there, stone lines become too straight, slabs stacked with an intention that feels more human than geologic. It has no plaque and no pamphlet, only the sense that someone once stood here and organized the rock into meaning. Was it a fort, a calendar, quarry leftovers, in a pattern coincidence invented? Some sites argue even when no one is trying to win. And the Ozarks have one more shadow to cast, a story of people without a name. Old farm ledgers, family lore, explorers' notes written in hands that shake on the page all point to a quiet group in the high hollows, craft different, walls different, wary of outsiders, content to vanish rather than be cataloged. Theories bloom wherever the record's thin. That is the danger of vacancy. It is so easy to fill with your favorite answer, but the oldest mountains in the state know how to keep a secret. They swallow sound well. Finally, we surface in St. Louis, a city with a cathedral of brick overhead and a honeycomb underfoot. Breweries carved coolness from limestone to lager their beer. Steam tunnels stitched factories together, and sewers carried the waste of ambition. Those are the official floors of the house. But behind bricked archways and sealed stairwells, explorers have found corridors that refuse to identify themselves. Some dead end in rubble. Others curve as if dodging a reason. Above, streets named for saints. Below, a palimpsest of the practical and the inexplicable. Long before breweries, this was Mound City, the skin of a Mississippian metropolis stretched across the bluffs. Most of the mounds are gone. The feeling that something remains is not. This is the shape of our journey. 9 chapters braided by sandstone and rumor, by the hard work of archaeology and the soft light of speculation. We will tread carefully where the past is not ours to own, center the voices who were here first, and still give wonder its room. We will watch experts scan carvings in microscopic detail and hear elders speak of sacred places that were never meant for crowds. We will test claims against geology, set folktales beside field notes, and admit when the silence of the record is the truest thing we have. Missouri is not just a place. It is a layered argument between what can be proven and what refuses to stop haunting. The petroglyphs, the rumored mines, the Osage relics, the giant bones, the granite riddle, the nameless tribe, the underground city, each is a doorway, and some open to rooms we have no right to enter. But we can stand on the threshold and listen. We can let the state be two things at once, documented and dreaming, mapped and still missing pieces. If you are ready, we will start with the oldest handwriting on the land, the messages pressed into stone by people who knew that rock outlives paper and that meaning can survive weather. Step lightly. The story begins where the rock remembers. On a broad sandstone shoulder above the big river, the sun turns the rock into a warm drumhead. Tap it with your knuckles, and you feel the thrum of time. Here, at Washington State Park an hour south of St. Louis, the past is not buried, it is etched on the surface. Spirals unwind like small galaxies. Thunderbirds stretch their wings between shallow peck marks. Human footprints unpaired, some solitary, stand mid-stride as if the walker just stepped into another century. Weapon shapes tally like grooves, abstract patterns that repeat with unsettling insistence. None of it is random. All of it is deliberate. Archaeologists agree on a few anchors. The carvings, known collectively as the Missouri petroglyphs, were made by native peoples, likely ancestors of the Osage Nation and related communities. Their age, the careful answer, is old enough to matter somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years. Stone won't give up its date the way charred wood does. You can't carbon date a groove. So researchers triangulate. They look at weathering, at styles echoed on pottery in nearby sites, at soil layers where artifacts cluster, and at oral histories that carry memory forward when data runs thin. The figures at Washington State Park share motifs with carvings at Thousand Hills State Park and with panels scattered into Arkansas and Illinois, suggesting a symbolic system that traveled with people, marriages, trade, and story. Stand close, and you can read the method in the mark. Many figures were made by pecking thousands of tiny blows that bruised the surface into form, while others were incised, a sharp edge drawn like a slow knife through butter. The difference matters. Pecking holds up better to rain and lichen. Incisions catch light at dawn and dusk, announcing themselves when the sun slides low. On humid mornings, moisture beads inside the grooves, and the images darken, as if the stone itself is breathing the symbols back to life. What were they for? The honest answer, we do not know for certain. But the repetition of motifs across distance argues for meaning deeper than doodle. Those carved footprints, for instance, they appear in pairs and in loners, pointing toward and away from river overlooks, clusters, and thresholds. Were they territorial markers, spirit paths, initiation records, proof that someone completed a hunt, a vigil, a season of learning? The Thunderbird adds another chord to the song. Across many nation stories, the Thunderbird commands storms and sky, a bringer of rain, a judge, a guardian that lives where thunder lives. Its presence here does not limit the interpretation. It opens it. A storm bringer etched above a river can be prayer, warning, gratitude, or all three at once. Placement is its own kind of text. Many Missouri panels favor edges ridgetops, where wind scrubs the rock clean, platforms that face east into the first light, slabs within earshot of falling water. Some researchers have mapped sightlines and noticed suggestive alignments, a spiral catching the solstice sunrise, a line of grooves that the equinox moon will touch like a bead string if you wait long enough. These are hypotheses, not verdicts. Human beings are good at finding patterns, and the land loves to complicate tidy explanations. Still, the idea that time, sun time, moon time helped organize these stones fits with what we know from other indigenous calendars spread across the continent. There's a quieter layer here, the one you feel more than see. Imagine the moment of making. Someone kneels. A harder stone in hand meets softer sandstone in measured taps. Hours pass. Weather passes. Perhaps there is singing. Perhaps there is silence. A child touches the new mark and learns not just the symbol, but the discipline. That meaning takes time. That the land is willing to carry it if you treat the land as kin. When we talk about records, we risk shrinking the carvings to data. To many indigenous people, these are not records at all, but living expressions, teachings bound to place. Sacred, in other words, not because they are old, but because they still work. If only the world were as careful. The last 2 centuries have not been kind to the panels that escape the protection of a park fence. Erosion gnaws at edges. Freeze-thaw cycles worry hairline cracks into open mouths. Bulldozers erased entire slabs before anyone thought to ask what was written on them. Some panels were dynamited and hauled away. Others were vandalized with initials, dates, hearts. Context: the archaeologist's oxygen went first. When a carving is pried loose from the rock that oriented it to river and horizon, you do not just lose an object. You lose the relationships that gave it sense. Yet there is good work underway. High-resolution 3D scanning and photogrammetry, thousands of overlapping photographs stitched into measurable models, are rescuing detail our eyes can no longer catch. Raking light imaging reveals shallow peck marks like old scars. Digital elevation models let researchers test whether an alignment is coincidence or design. Layered with environmental data and, crucially, with indigenous oral histories, the picture sharpens. We learn, for example, which motifs cluster near water and which prefer heights, which panels have a processional logic to their layout, and which elements were added centuries apart, turning a stone into a palimpsest of ceremony. Indigenous communities are not just sources for interpretation. They are stewards and originators. Tribal historic preservation offices collaborate with state agencies to protect access, limit harm, and decide what should and should not be shown to the public. Some sites are appropriate for visitors. Others are not. This is not gatekeeping so much as caretaking, the same kind of ethical boundary you keep around a family graveyard. For viewers, the etiquette is simple. Look, learn, photograph without touching, and leave the rock cooler than you found it. Oils from a single hand can darken a 1,000-year-old line. A boot sole can crush a lichen mat that took decades to spread. Of course, mystery attracts noise. Alternative researchers have proposed star maps, ancient ships, even visitors from other worlds. You will hear about humanoid forms that do not fit, lines that appear to encode astronomical constants, arrows that must point to treasure. The mainstream response is not contempt but context. Extraordinary claims require evidence equal to the carving's patience. Almost always, ethnographic parallels and the hard limits of geology make the simpler human reading stronger and, frankly, far more astonishing. That a community maintained a symbolic language across generations without paper, that they set meaning into bedrock with tools of stone and bone, that they chose high places and river lips so the sky and water could finish the composition, that is wonder enough. Go early if you visit. Let the low sun rake across the terrace so the carvings rise out of shadow. Step back until the whole panel snaps into view. Then stoop down and study a single groove. Between the overlook and the footprint, you are standing on a bridge the carvers meant to last. They succeeded. We are the fragile ones here, brief as lichens in a late frost, trying to learn how to read a language that knew we would come and tried, in patience and stone, to be ready for us. Hidden in the hollows and ridgelines of the Ozark Mountains, a rumor keeps breathing. It rises with the mist in the first cool of morning and curls back into cedar shadows by noon. Ask a fisherman at the put-in or a farmer mending fence on a limestone slope, and you will get the same careful shrug. People used to pull silver out of these hills. Not just lead, which Missouri has in spades, or zinc, which dragged entire towns into boom and bust, but silver bright, soft, improbable veins spidering through the Ozark Plateau, and then vanishing just as the stories get specific. These tales do not begin with the starry-eyed prospector in a floppy hat. They reach further back, to native knowledge of the land's moods, to trails that knew where the rock bled metal and where it did not. Later, in the 1600s and 1700s, the Spanish supposedly slipped into this country under the canopy of the Oaks, small expeditions with big intentions, working in secret. The legend says they built hushed camps guarded by a handful of soldiers, smelted at night, and kept their mouths shut by day. Something went wrong: resistance, sickness, infighting, and they sealed their shafts before they disappeared, leaving stone markers and crosses no modern map can quite collect. Proof is the ghost that never quite sits for a photograph. Scattered across southern Missouri, you will hear about a smelter, just a ring of fused rock half, swallowed by soil or a crude bloom of slag, a heavy glassy lump you can't explain away as a campfire leftover. Ranchers talk of carved crosses on sycamores and bedrock, arrows chipped into boulders that point like rumors point toward the next story. Treasure hunters pass dog-eared photocopies of old Spanish charts, hand-drawn maps with ink the color of tea, always a generation removed, always just specific enough to get you into trouble. The epicenter of one thread coils around the word Silver Dollar City, a name most people now link to roller coasters and funnel cakes. Long before the park, locals swapped tales of settlers nosing into tunnels timbered with hand-hewn beams, pick marks still scalloping the stone like teeth. Some insisted these were not caves at all, but the ribs of a mine collapsed in on itself. In Christian and Stone counties, the stories grow darker. A man finds a barred shaft and vanishes. A pair of diggers are turned back by officials nobody can name. Landowners go tight-lipped overnight. Sometimes bad luck is a sinkhole. Sometimes it is a warning. If this were only romance, geology would knock it flat. But geology, properly read, is a trickster. Missouri's bones are rich in galena lead sulfide that has paid wages for centuries. Silver is rare here, yes, but not absent. It can occur as tiny passengers in lead ore. Smelters in the old days sometimes teased out ounces by cupellation, chasing the ghost metal out of molten lead into a trembling bead. That is enough to start a rumor, if the rumor needed help at all. Imagine one lucky strike, a pocket hot enough to turn heads. You do not need a mother lode to plant a legend, just a glint at the right moment. The Spanish angle survives not because documents nail it down, they do not, but because the terrain makes secrecy plausible. The Ozarks are stingy with straight lines. Forests close in. Ridges stack like waves frozen mid-break. Caves mouth open into darkness and then narrow into teeth. Even now, with GPS and satellite eyes, you can step off a gravel road and vanish from sight and signal in minutes. In the 18th century, a small party could mine in daylight and disappear by sundown without leaving more than a curl of smoke, and a line of mule prints the rain would steal by morning. Enter the modern seekers, part scientist, part storyteller. They bring metal detectors and GPR units that look like baby strollers for ghosts, dowsing rods for those who trust the feel of the land over the language of graphs, and boots built for side-hilling through greenbrier and shale. They follow creeks upstream to where the water thins. They check bluffs for squared offcuts in the stone. They measure slag with magnets and hope for silver's reluctant whisper. Every few years someone announces a find, a collapsed adit, a sealed entrance, a cache of ore, and then goes quiet. Maybe a lawyer called. Maybe the mine only existed between dust and dusk. Maybe the secret is the point. The Osage complicate and clarify at once. Early European accounts describe Osage people wearing silver ornaments, bright discs that caught the sun. No open pits have been found on Osage land. No obvious mine mouths stare from the hills. Trade is the most likely answer. A long-distance network that braided the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and carried copper, shell, pipestone, and yes, silver, hand to hand. Still, uncertainty invites myth. Perhaps the Osage knew a place the rest of us have forgotten. Allege they were not foolish enough to widen into a wound. Skeptics do the honest work of asking for receipts. They note that 19th century newspapers loved a good fantasy, and that amateur digs rarely kept the kind of notes archaeologists need. They show how misidentified animal bones grew men to 9 feet tall, and how a natural cave can borrow the look of an adit if you squint from the right angle. None of that kills the story. It improves it. The part that survives doubt the part about curiosity turns out to be the only vein worth mining to exhaustion. Because the Ozarks do not just hide things. They curate them. They choose what to show and when to show it. One storm uncovers a timber you swear is a collar set. The next storm eats it whole. A drought pulls the creek back like a curtain and reveals a circle of stone blackened by heat. The spring thaw tosses gravel over it as if embarrassed by the indiscretion. If there are lost mines, they are kept by a land that favors talon grip over open palm. So what is true? True is the smell of damp limestone at the mouth of a hollow. True is the clang of a loose rock that sounds like a bell and makes a person turn their head and listen. True is the geological record, the ledgers of lead and zinc, the trace silver that sometimes smiles from a crucible uninvited. True is a hand-drawn map that brings a grandson and his grandfather into the woods together with a thermos and a story. True is a warning. Old shafts kill the curious. Trespass erodes more than soil. Private land is not a rumor. It is a boundary. But beyond the caution tape and the cave-ins, there is a reason the legend lives. Treasure is the decoy. Wonder is the prize. The Ozarks teach a particular kind of patience, the kind that looks into brush and sees possibility instead of emptiness, that reads a slope the way you read a page, that understands how a single glint of metal can seed a century of telling. Maybe a hunter will stumble on a sealed entrance tomorrow. Maybe nobody ever will. Either way, the pocket worth finding has always been the one inside the listener, where a quiet country can turn a small mystery into a durable hope. In the Ozarks, mystery is not just part of the landscape, it is the landscape, braided into root and ridge, river and rumor. Follow it, if you go, with your eyes open and your feet gentle. The Osage River moves like a long thought, unspooling from high, wooded shoulders to its quiet handshake with the Missouri near Jefferson City. Stand on a bluff after rain, and you can hear it working, sanding down yesterday into silt, lifting small histories and ferrying them a bend or two before laying them down again. The river has moods, and each mood reveals something different. In drought it pulls its hem high and shows you what it has been hiding, a clay bank laced with charcoal, a scatter of chert flakes bright as fish scales, a pipe bowl smoothed by centuries of lips that no longer speak. In flood it takes back what we did not deserve, scrubs the edges, rearranges our certainty. The water is patient. People are not. Along the Osage's middle and lower banks, the ground has a habit of answering questions nobody asked out loud. Farmers plowing terraces in Miller and Cole counties turned up more than arrowheads, stone blades so large and carefully worked they seemed ceremonial rather than practical. Figurines with faces stretched into the realm of story. Flat stones incised with patterns that looked deliberate, as if someone had bothered to teach the rock a new alphabet. Burial mounds, some small as sleeping dogs, some layered and lined with stone, punctuated the floodplain. When opened, they yielded pipes, ornaments, and tools arranged as if the dead were not done traveling. Then the century advanced, and with it, plowed depth. Mounds sagged under rows of corn. Road cuts bit into their flanks. The river chewed a few straight off the map. What complicates the story is the sense of a choir rather than a soloist. Not everything dug from Osage country fits neatly into Osage tradition as we understand it today. Some artifacts echo Hopewell grace those elegant, far-reaching networks that stitched the Midwest together with exchange and ceremony 2 millennia ago. Others carry the muscular geometry of Mississippian design, the culture that built cities of earth and wood and ruled by corn and calendar. The Osage themselves came later, yet their name now wraps the river and the counties around it. This overlap is not a contradiction. It is music. Cultures hum through one another. A motif migrates. An idea is adopted, adapted, remembered. The problem is not the objects. It is their dislocation. 19th and early 20th century, collecting tour artifacts from their settings the way a child rips a page from a book, then expects the paragraph to make sense on its own. A pipe in a glass case, without a note about the soil it slept in, tells you very little. A carved tablet, without the angle it faced, without the horizon line it addressed, becomes raw data for whatever story the finder prefers. The records we do have are patchy. Newspaper clippings with breathless italics, field notes that forget to mention which field, museum drawers with tags that say Osage R, as if a river were a GPS coordinate. Still, the river keeps teaching. From a canoe, you begin to notice where the old ones chose to stand. Terrace edges with a long view downstream. Knuckles of high ground the flood can't quite reach. Little platforms of sand that seem to pour up from nowhere when the water falls. On these benches you find the leavings of daily life, flakes from a morning of tool making, a potsherd that still remembers the press of a fingertip, a deer bone all polished by hours of use. And then there are the outliers, the pieces that make you sit back on your heels, a bird effigy pipe whose curve anticipates flight, a tablet scored with deep lines that refuse to resolve into a pattern the eye can name. At moments like this, the river feels less like a boundary and more like a library, its stacks rearranged by weather. If we have any right to optimism after so much loss, it comes from the way the work is changing. Non-invasive tools, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, drone-based LiDAR let archaeologists listen before they dig. Radar sends pulses into the soil and hears back the difference between natural layers and human disturbance. A pit, a trench, a post-hole choir singing in rows. Magnetometers feel subtle shifts where fire once lived. LiDAR, sweeping from above, peels away the foliage in a digital sense and reveals low earth and mounds hiding under oak and sumac, the invisible architecture of ancient decisions. Pair these maps with careful footwork, and the picture becomes less guesswork, more conversation. More important than the tools are the voices guiding them. The Osage Nation's historic preservation leaders are walking the banks with researchers and, just as crucially, setting terms. Some places are for ceremony and memory, not for display. Some knowledge is communal, some is held close. Collaboration replaces extraction, consent-based surveys, limited public access, protocols for reburial where disturbance has already occurred, in a century that mistook possession for understanding. This turn toward stewardship feels like a corrective and a blessing. When the people whose ancestors made the record lead the reading of it, the questions get better. Every now and then the past steps out of the silt like it never left. After a long dry spell, a low meander slices into an older bank and writes a cross-section in sand and clay. A charcoal lens from a fire whose last warmth was 1,000 years ago. A seam of shell from a meal. A small cache of broken blades placed together as if to retire their edges with respect. You kneel, you look, you do not touch. You take a photo, take a breath, and imagine hands doing the same work in the same light under a sky that had not yet learned your name. Sometimes the river returns a face pottery molded into a human countenance, with exaggerated eyes and a mouth set for song or warning, and you feel watched in the oldest, kindest way. The land is not ours. We live on the top layer of a book already written. It is easy to mourn what has gone, the mounds leveled for pasture, the tablets traded out of county for $1 and a story, the figurines that sleep in attics without provenance like exiles. But mourning alone is another kind of erasure. Better to learn the etiquette the river teaches. Do not stand where the bank undercuts. Do not chase a rumor into private land. Do not take what you can't return. Better to add to the record what little you can. A GPS point, a photo of a cut bank, a note filed with someone who keeps such notes for a living. Better to remember that the Osage River is not just a route. It is a witness. It saw more than we will, and it remembers in ways we are only beginning to respect. When the light goes low and the water turns pewter, you can see shallow riffles tracing old channels like veins through a hand. That is the map the fish read, the herons, the people before us. We read it badly, but we are learning. The river forgives more than it should. The least we can do is thank it with patience. The next flood will lift a new clue. The next drought will lay another down. If we are careful, the fragments will begin to lean toward each other until they whisper a shape we recognize, not a single culture, not a tidy timeline, but a braided history thick enough to hold. The legend in Gasconade County does not shout. It clears its throat and lets you lean in. Mid-19th century settlers were the first to tell it with conviction, men and women turning prairie and timber into pasture, bringing up from the soil not just flint and fossils, but bones that argued with proportion. The stories agree on the same unsettling math: skeletons said to measure 7, 8, even 9 feet from crown to heel, rib cages as broad as barrels, jawbones so large a grown man could set his own jaw inside and rattle it like a toy. In a few reports, the dead sit upright in the earth, knees pulled close as if the grave were a chair, arranged with a kind of ceremony that felt intentional and uncomfortably intimate. Then there's the detail that sticks like a fishbone: double rows of teeth, a phrase that echoed from county to county until it became a signature flourish in papers hungry for sensation. The newspaper age loved a marvel. Editors inked the word giant with a smile, knowing it would sell 4 extra columns of ads for patent tonics and new stoves. Amateur excavations, conducted with curiosity but little method, tore into mounds whose builders were long gone and whose meanings were never theirs to untie. Bones surfaced, were measured with guesswork, and vanished into parlors, school cabinets, private collections anywhere but the kind of ledger that would let a future scholar test a claim. Every mystery thrives on a second act, and so a rumor took the lead. The Smithsonian had carted off the biggest specimens and smothered the evidence in its vaults. No document has ever stood up to that suspicion, but it persists because absence is fertile soil. To make sense of Gasconade's giants, you have to widen the frame. Across the Midwest in that same breathless century, similar reports surfaced from Ohio's gentle hills to Tennessee's river bends, Wisconsin's kettle country to West Virginia's mounds. The stage directions rarely change: oversized skulls, long bones that stretch a tape to the limit, burials that seem dignified rather than haphazard, artifacts nearby that whisper ceremony rather than accident. Put these alongside the earthwork traditions of Edina and Hopewell cultures, builders of mounds and embankments, careful curators of ritual space, and the mind draws lines. But drawing lines is not the same as proving a picture. Skepticism is not a buzzkill. It is a light switch. First, there is the precision problem. Bones taken from earth that has been tamped, flooded, plowed, and tamped again can warp. Measurements made with a farmer's stick and a good intention are not measurements that stand in court. Photographs are scarce and often ambiguous. And those double rows of teeth, human mouths, sometimes present crowding or accessory teeth, severe where patterns can create the illusion of a second row. A jawbone laid near a skull can trick the eye into counting twice. Add in misidentified megafauna, bison, elk, even the odd bear, and a few pranksters with a flair for papier-mâché, and you have got enough noise to drown a signal. Still, a clean debunking never quite lands. That is partly because the land itself won't let the story die. Gasconade County wears a certain quiet. River bends that crease the farmland, oak ridges that hold their shade like a grudge, limestone bluffs that catch evening light and make a person believe in oversized ancestors. Old family maps hand-drawn, stained with oil from fingers that work, mark a burial on a ridge that is now a bean field. A great-grandparent's ledger mentions bones, large in a list that otherwise tracks seed, weather, and debts. Some memories arrive not as claims, but as hesitations. The place where you do not plow too deep. The patch of ground a child is told to respect without being told why. What if the truth is less grand and somehow more human? Gigantism exists, a rare endocrine disorder that can push stature far beyond average. It does not make a race. It makes an individual. A community might have buried such a person with particular honor, their size folded into story the way remarkable lives often are. Now imagine a handful of such burials scattered over a wide geography and an era that loved a headline. Exaggeration does the rest, stretching 7 feet to 9 the way time stretches a fish from a morning's catch into an afternoon's legend. Set aside size for a moment and consider the context. Most reports gesture toward mounds. The eastern half of North America is a palimpsest of earthen architecture, conical mounds, effigy forms, geometric earthworks raised by societies whose ceremonial life was rich and whose mortuary practices were careful. Where settlers dug without guidance, they entered rooms mid-ritual and mistook arrangement for anomaly. Seated burials, clustered interments, grave goods that placed the dead within a web of relationships. None of this proves giants. but all of it proves intention. The people under those mounds were not accidents of geology. They were citizens of complex worlds. Science does not forbid wonder. It disciplines it. If a giant skeleton exists in a way that matters verifiable, measurable, contextual, it will arrive with a chain of custody, provenience notes, osteological analysis, DNA results, radiocarbon dates from associated materials, and a community consultation that addresses the ethics of disturbing the dead at all. Lacking that, we can do two things at once. We can hold the legend lightly, neither mocking nor marrying it. And we can commit to a better practice with what remains, to leave undisturbed sites undisturbed, to work with descending communities when erosion or construction forces exposure, to treat bones as ancestors, not props. Meanwhile, the Gasconade River loops and loops, and the county goes about its small, enduring work cutting hay, mending fence, schooling children who will inherit both the land and the stories. On summer evenings, the light sifts through bur oak and walnut, and it is easy to feel watched by something larger than your understanding. Maybe that is projection. Maybe that is what the land does to anyone who stops long enough to listen. The legend of the giants endures not because it wins arguments, but because it voices a yearning we rarely admit, that the past might contain beings big enough morally, spiritually, physically to recalibrate our scale of the possible. Perhaps the bones were mismeasured. Perhaps they were never there. Perhaps a few were extraordinary, and the rest were ordinary stories told in extraordinary fonts. What remains, durable as limestone, is the instinct to look down at a furrow or an eroding bank and imagine a hand that was here before yours, a person whose life carried weight. The better we get at honoring that instinct without trespass or fantasy, the closer we come to a truth that needs no inches to impress. We are small in a long country, and humility, not height, is what lets us see. From the parking lot at Elephant Rock State Park, the world is pure spectacle, great pink boulders, rounded like sleeping animals, children scrambling from elephant to elephant, camera shutters ticking like cicadas. The granite has a cheerful face here, sun-warmed and photogenic, a billion-year-old playground. But climb a little higher, leave the loop trail, follow a deer path through oak and hickory, and the mood shifts. The chatter drops away. Wind gathers itself along the ridge, and the rock begins, quietly, to arrange itself. At first it is just a sense, a line that holds too straight for too long, a slab propped on another slab in a way that suggests intention instead of accident. Then your eyes adjust, and a pattern resolves, short segments of dry-laid granite that recall walls, platforms broad enough to stand three abreast, enclosure-like forms that hug the ridge's spine. Moss softens the joints. Lichen embroiders the seams. Nothing here announces fort-like a postcard ruin. It is older, or perhaps simply quieter than that. Locals have called it the Stone Fort for generations because names need somewhere to rest, and mystery prefers a chair to the floor. The bedrock beneath your boots belongs to the St. Francois Mountains, among the oldest exposed formations in North America. Time here is vertical. You feel it in your ankles, and the way light thins toward evening and turns the granite rose. Long before Missouri had counties or county lines, this dome shouldered the sky. That age lends the ridge a gravity that encourages stories, and stories came of ceremonies held above the trees, of lookouts that scanned the valleys for friend or foe, of alignments tuned to sun and moon the way a flute is tuned to air. One early 20th century survey crew made a note artificial arrangement and moved on. The paper trail thins. The stones do not. There are three explanations that take turns convincing you, depending on which rock you are standing on. The first is deliberate construction by human hands, sometime in the deep past, a complex of low walls and platforms for defense, ritual, or both. The second is a natural arrangement sculpted by freeze-thaw, exfoliation, and gravity, with pattern-seeking humans doing what we do best, finding faces in the clouds and intention in a slump of stone. The third is an industrial afterimage, 19th century quarry work and spoil piles, later weathered and overgrown into the suggestion of ancient architecture. Each theory gathers evidence. None closes the case. Walk the ridge with a cautious mind, and you notice where the quarry story fits. Elephant Rocks was a working site once. The granite that paved cities and framed windows came out of these hills and blocks, squared with drills and feathers and wedges. In certain cuts, you can still see row of half-round drill scars, like a dotted line across flesh. Quarrying leaves debris, and debris, left long enough, looks inevitable. But some of the fort features sit well away from the known works. Some lack the signature bite marks of tools. Some are so draped in old growth lichen that you would need 100 years of stillness just to embroider that much green. Industrial patterns explain a portion, not the whole. Stand at one of the platforms near the ridge's crown and test the second idea, celestial intention. A cut between boulders frames a slice of horizon. On solstice mornings and equinox evenings, does the sun travel that window maybe? Human beings are good at drawing lines between stars and stakes, and across the continent there are stone works that indisputably track sky time. Here, the suggestion is strong enough to raise the hair on your forearms and weak enough to make you doubt your own spine. A hypothesis, not a verdict. The land loves a maybe. As for defense, the ridge sells the role. It is a natural citadel high, 360-degree views, steep approaches that turn attackers into climbers. A low wall here is not a wall so much as a boundary, the kind that signals inside to those who know and do not to those who do not. The Civil War brushed these hills. Fort Davidson and the Battle of Pilot Knob sit just down the road, and a person can't help layering one century's violence over the possible needs of a more ancient one. Yet no artifacts in clear, published context have tied these particular stones to a specific culture or date. Without context, certainty is just a louder tone of guess. It is tempting to outsource the mystery to more exotic authors. Fringe theories arrive with passports already stamped: Phoenicians, Celts, Atlantis refugees, who dragged their masonry up the ridge and left it like a calling card. These tales offer glamour where patience offers process, but they devour evidence to feed appetite. The truth almost always more local, more human, more hard-earned rarely needs a boat. Missouri is full of hands that could stack a stone, and a reason to stack it. If the site turns out to be ceremonial, the ceremony belongs to people whose descendants still have a say. If it is natural, its beauty does not shrink. It sharpens. What we can say without trespass is this: intent lives in the feel of the place. The ridge conducts attention. Your foot falls slow. You measure distance not in yards, but in breaths. The enclosures gather wind in their corners. A platform frames a view so exactly you suspect a designer, even if the designer was weather. Every now and then a jay's scream rips the quiet and stitches it back together. You stand where someone stood: quarrier, pilgrim, lookout, war child, and the rock answers with an old, cool patience. The present comes here to get small. If there is a future for the stone fort, it lies in humility. A careful survey that maps every block and gap. A review of quarry records and photographs that might anchor what is industrial and what is not. Non-invasive measurements to test alignment claims against the sky's actual mathematics, rather than our wishful eyes. Most of all, a conversation with tribal historians about whether this ridge holds meanings that do not belong on YouTube. Some sites are for public wonder. Some are for quiet and a very small number of feet. Until then, the best practice is the oldest one: go lightly. Do not pull lichen from a seam to see better. Do not rearrange a stone to fit a theory. Do not leave anything but your warmth on the granite and a little of your hurry in the parking lot. When you come down from the ridge, the families among the rounded giants will still be laughing. The afternoon still sweet on the pink shoulders of ancient rock. You will have carried a question up and brought it back down again unchanged, which is not failure. It is fidelity. Some puzzles are meant to be lived with, not solved. The ridge will hold its counsel long after we have forgotten our arguments. That may be the point. Sometimes the past leaves no words, only stones, and trusts us to learn the grammar of silence. In the Ozark Mountains, some stories do not walk the roads. They move through cedar thickets and along dry creek beds, staying just out of sight. The tale of a people without a name lives there, tucked into steep hollows and ridgetops where fog forgets to lift. You do not find it in textbooks or museum labels. You hear it in kitchens at midnight and in the long pause between an old-timer sentences, as if the hills themselves are listening in. The outline never quite changes. Before settlers, before even the Osage held the country in their stories, another group lived here, quiet, apart, and then gone. The counties named most often are Shannon, Oregon, and Douglas, those rolling green quadrants where gravel roads go from washboard to whisper and the forest keeps its own secrets. Back in the 1800s, as cabins sprouted near springs and fields clawed their way out of timber, people reported finding things that did not fit the patterns they expected. Not grand ruins, nothing so obliging, just the stubborn evidence of hands. Stone walls laid into hillsides where no pasture needed fencing. Rock shelters blackened by hearth smoke in clever crescents, tucked to catch winter sun. Tools with a flair for edge and angle that did not match the local-style settlers had been taught to call Indian. Burial places turned up, too. The accounts are messy, with mystery graves on high ground, artifacts with unfamiliar incisions, pottery whose faces were stretched and stylized into expressions the finders could not name. Then come the sightings, the kind the next generation blushes to repeat, and repeats anyway. Families say their grandparents spoke of wary people in the hills, traveling in small bands, light-skinned and dark-haired in some tellings. In others, simply not from any tribe we knew. They kept to the seams of the country, where a ridge breaks just enough to hide a path, and spoke in a dialect no one could place. They traded occasionally and without hurry, then folded back into the timber as if they belonged to the green. Rituals were whispered about, fires banked low in rock rings, songs without words, carvings on bluffs that borrowed no alphabet any local schoolmaster could identify. And then, as the century turned, the people thinned to rumor. Some say they retreated deeper. Others say they ended. Explorers and surveyors added their own shaky lines to the sketch. An early trapper wrote of stone villages on ridgetops, more permanents than the wood and hide structures he recognized. A cave ledger noted glyphs, not quite like those in the wider Mississippi Valley, simpler in some ways, stranger in others, a syntax that felt internal. In a handful of contested reports, graves on high spines were said to hold skeletons with long, narrow skulls or with limbs unusually long in proportion. Skeptics point out how easily description strays when a dig is more curiosity than science, when soil has shifted and bones have settled, when a man writes by lantern and ambition. They are right, but the persistence of the stories makes them hard to throw away completely. The hills catch them and hand them back. Theories, as always, arrive with the open arms of certainty. One branch insists on imported origins, the lost white tribe, shipwrecked Spaniards or stray Welshmen, Europeans who staggered inland, intermarried, and mythologized themselves. Another drapes the Ozarks in biblical tapestry, linking its nameless people to the 10 lost tribes of Israel, a notion built more from longing than from evidence. These versions flatter the teller by making the mystery about someone familiar. They rarely survive the first hard question, and yet they linger because they are seductively tidy. The hills, on the other hand, prefer a messier, humbler truth. That truth may simply be this: an isolated native community lived here before Mississippian influence reached deep into the Ozarks, developing tools, art, and lifeways shaped by a country of caves, chert, and thin soil. Remoteness breeds dialects of language, of pottery, of how you stack a stone to keep the wind off your sleeping. The Osage, whose memory runs long and brave, have told stories of earlier forest dwellers, people who melted away when strangers crossed a certain line. Those tales may be metaphor. They may be memoir. Either way, they recognize what the terrain makes possible. A culture can burn steadily at low flame in a deep hollow for generations and leave behind a record, so local it reads like silence to the rest of us. The 19th and early 20th centuries did not help. Newspapers turned mystery into merchandise, printing anything that sounded like a headline and very little that sounded like a field note. Artifacts disappeared into parlors and curio cabinets. into trunks that moved from farmhouse to farmhouse until the label fell off and the story with it. Amateur excavations destroyed context, the sacred orientation of a grave, the small sequence clues of soil, and left only loose objects that said too little, too loudly. Even the sincere often lacked a ledger. Without dates, without provenience, a piece of pottery becomes a mirror for whatever idea the holder likes best. Yet the land continues to both complicate and clarify. In this new century, hikers near Eminence and Mountain View come across stone lines that do not hold cattle and can't be explained by logging. A flash of afternoon light pulls a carved figure out of a bluff face, not a tourist's heart with initials, but a set of careful grooves that make your scalp rise. A flood eats a bank and shows a fire lens, a scatter of flakes, the ghost of a post hole dark against clay. Cavers report bits of worked bone in crevices no tourist will ever reach, and then do the right thing back out and leave the place unmentioned on social media, because secrecy is sometimes the best conservation tool the Ozarks have left. It is tempting to press for a verdict, to demand that the story close itself around one solid noun. But a better, kinder discipline is to let the uncertainty breathe. Some mysteries inform by remaining possible. They teach us how to move through a landscape that predates our certainty, how to ask permission from a place rather than take it. That looks like simple etiquette on the ground: no trespassing on private holdings, no digging on public land, no theft disguised as rescue. It looks like consultation when storms or bulldozers force the past into the present. It looks like being content with photographs, coordinates, and careful reports given to people who keep better records than rumor does. Late in the day, down in a narrow glade where sycamores lift their white arms, the air holds a cool that feels older than the hour. A creek ticks over limestone, and the path you thought you were following loses interest and fades. You stop because the land tells you to. A low rock wall trails into fern, and then into nothing, as if a sentence broke off in the middle and waited for someone fluent in the language to finish it. Maybe the nameless people were never lost. Maybe we were. And this is how the hills correct our sense of scale, by refusing to translate themselves fully for anyone in a hurry. Whether the tribe existed as a single, traceable culture or as a chorus of small, related camps dispersed over centuries, the lesson lands the same. The Ozarks hold more past than we have patience to read, and some of its pages belong to those who can still claim them as family. We can listen, though. We can walk softly. We can admit that not every absence is a gap to be filled. Some are the shape of reverence. St. Louis wears its history like brick layered, load-bearing, and not always square to the street. Above ground, the city is a clean story: stadium cheers, red brick rows, the scent of yeast and barbecue, a river that looks like a road made of muscle. But 2 steps below the curb, the story frays into corridors and cul-de-sacs of time. The city's underworld is not a single thing. It is a collage. Some of it is obvious beer caves and sewers, some of it is rumor's home address. All of it breathes when you listen. Start in Soulard and Lafayette Square, where 19th century breweries turned limestone into climate control. Long before refrigeration, beer needed cool, steady cellars to sleep itself into lager. So crews cut caverns into the soft bedrock under the blocks, arched rooms big enough to swallow a wagon, corridors that tacked like a ship through stone, air that stayed kind despite summer's push. These are real. You can still find the old ventilation shafts and the brick mouths that once exhaled the smell of ferment. But along the walls where the chisel marks end, some explorers whisper. Other passageways begin narrower, older, not listed on any maintenance map, with steps that drop into a second, unaccounted for layer of dark. The Limp story is the one people tell when the light gets thin. The Limp family built a beer empire above a web of caverns south of downtown, and the Limp Mansion's reputation for hauntings has turned rumor into a pastime. They say a tunnel ran from the brewery complex toward Cherokee Street, that another reached toward Bellefontaine Cemetery, that wealthy men liked the idea of secrets that traveled underground while their reputations stayed dry at the surface. The proof: it is always down a staircase that has been bricked up, always behind a wall you are not supposed to move, always in a place where a city inspector shakes his head and closes a door. Maybe that lack of certainty is the point. The clandestine breathes best behind mortar. Beneath the romance is machinery. SD. Lewis ran on steam and coal for a century, and where there is steam, there are tunnels, utility corridors that stitched factories and depots together, conduits for pipes, conduits for men. The modern sewer system added its brick cathedrals, barrels, and egg-shaped runs, arched ceilings that carry the work of the living out to a river that has never said no. A person with a hard hat and a city badge can walk for miles in the sanctioned dark, but even they will tell you how often an old line breaks into a room with no name, a stone arch that predates the brick by a generation, an angle that makes no infrastructural sense. Cities, like people, forget parts of themselves. And then there is the oldest silence, the one before beer. Long before French traders named a fur post after a saint. Long before brick and iron and smokestacks. This was Mound City. The Mississippian earthworks, thousands of them in the wider region, dotted the bluffs and river flats, ceremonial and civic, burial and calendar. A skyline of shaped earth that said we are here without stone. Most of the mounds are gone, plowed flat or carted away for fill when the city hurried itself into modernity. But 19th century builders wrote about strange finds beneath their foundations, stone-lined vaults where no vault should be, bones and artifacts in layers that did not match a cellar's logic, stacked stone that refused to declare a purpose. Are these misreadings of natural cavities? Possibly. Are they shadows of structures older than beer and brick? Possibly. In a city built on erasure? Possibly is the most honest word you can use. Urban explorers bring back postcards from the dark, grainy photos of arched brick, of staircases that lead up to nothing, of rooms big enough to float a dream. Some post the images and say just enough to keep you guessing. Others keep their coordinates to themselves for reasons that combine caution and respect. The air down there is fickle. The floors change their mind mid-step. And the law is very clear. Underground trespass is still trespass. Add the hazard of losing oxygen or finding a drop you did not plan for, and the city's official silence starts to look less like a conspiracy and more like a responsibility. Even so, the underground introduces itself by accident. A contractor jackhammers a basement wall, and the dust opens into a tunnel. A street repair collapses onto a void with a brick spine. A new foundation exposes a stone stair that descends to a door the color of centuries. Sometimes it is simply the remnant of a spur line, a coal chute, a cistern belly, a Prohibition-era hidey hole for whiskey with ambitions. Sometimes it is not. The city crew shakes their heads, take a few photos for the file, and brick it up. The map gets a new asterisk nobody will see. Fraternal orders float through the stories like a watermark. In the late 1800s, SD. Lewis pulsed with lodges, masons, odd fellows, groups that loved ritual and private rooms. It is easy to imagine a subterranean chamber dressed for oaths and echo, a tunnel connecting a meeting hall to a discreet exit. It is also easy to build a fantasy on top of a boiler room. The line between secrecy and infrastructure is a thin brick thick. Step too fast, and you fall through. The most persuasive theory is plural. There is no single, ancient subway under SD. Lewis, no Rome of the Midwest humming beneath traffic. There is instead a long palimpsest where each generation rode its needs into the ground transport, storage, ceremony, waste, and then half erased the sentence when the need went away. What remains is a grammar of arches and corridors that sometimes rhyme and sometimes do not. A set of spaces that serve no current purpose except to remind us how busy the past once was. Above, the gateway arch arcs against the river light like a metal idea that finally landed. Below, arches you will never see teach the same lesson in brick and limestone, that permanence is not the same as clarity, that a city's memory is a negotiation between map and rumor. If you listen on certain nights in Soulard, you can feel the limestone breathe cool up from the old loggering caves. If you stand in a basement in Lafayette Square, when the furnace cuts, you can hear a hollow behind the wall answer back. That is the city talking in its sleep. Curiosity is a noble impulse. So is restraint. The underground is dangerous, and it is not ours to break. If the tunnels you have dreamed about are real, they will show themselves to the right eyes at the right time. A maintenance crew, a historian with paperwork, a camera on a tether lowered carefully into a newly revealed mouth. And if some of the rumors never resolve, that, too, is a kind of preservation. Mystery is a structure. It holds weight when evidence can't. So yes, there is a hidden SD. Lewis. You walk over it when you buy bread, and when you catch a game, when you park, when you kiss someone goodbye at a front door, flanked by 140 years of brick. Part of it is mapped, part of it is guessed, and part of it is the city's way of keeping a little of itself for itself. The ground remembers what we build into it. The rest of us learn to listen, to stand still long enough to feel the echo push back through our souls, and to accept a truth as old as the limestone itself. Not every question wants a key. Some just want company in the dark. When you add it all up, the petroglyphs that breathe under fingertips, the silver that may have flashed once and seeded a century of searching, the river that lifts artifacts like memories, the tall stories that outgrew the bones that started them, the granite riddle on a ridge of billion-year-old stone, the whispers of a people who preferred the folds of the hills to the pages of our books, and the city with lacework stitched in limestone below. It looks less like a catalog of mysteries and more like a single conversation. Missouri talks in layers. It speaks through rock and through rumor, through careful measurements, and through the hush that follows a good question. If you stand still long enough, you can hear the motifs repeat. Intention, erasure, survival, wonder. They arrive in different costumes, footprints pecked into sandstone, slag turned up in a creek bed, a platform of granite that frames exactly enough horizon to feel deliberate, but they gesture toward the same old truth. The land keeps more than we know, and it decides what to return. The temptation is to choose a side. On one end, skepticism sharpened to a blade, cutting away anything that does not arrive with provenance and a lab report. On the other, belief so hungry it eats its own evidence, preferring tidy legends to messy realities. But the terrain we have walked does not reward extremes. It asks for balance. Archaeology is our discipline context, dates, chains of custody, collaboration with descendant communities who get to say what happens to their ancestors' work and remains. Wonder, though, is our fuel. Without it, the petroglyph is only a groove, the tunnel only a void. With it, a spiral becomes a calendar we can't read yet. A stone room under a street becomes an inheritance from an earlier need. A rumor becomes a good question we have not earned the right to answer. Preservation sounds like a carved word, but it is ordinary in practice. It looks like keeping your hands off a panel of carvings after a rain made the lines glow. Like reporting a cut bank that just exposed a charcoal lens instead of prying at it. Like not sharing coordinates for a fragile bluff face where a figure sleeps in the rock. It looks like pausing at the edge of a ridge and asking who should be here before deciding that you should. It looks like listening when the Osage or any nation tells you a site story is not yours to retell, that some places are for ceremony and not for content. In a state where so much has already been scraped and hauled, the quiet choice counts. That quiet is not passive. It is an active kind of attention. It helps to read the grammar the land prefers. Rivers are editors. They delete what is not hold and reveal what should be read again. Caves are vaults. They keep secrets until the door breaks, and then they ask you to close it gently. Granite ridges are memories without captions. They require you to resist writing a legend into every alignment. Cities are palimpsests. They do not forget so much as overwrite, and if you read the brick and limestone closely, you can make out the previous sentences beneath. None of this is mystical. All of it is practical, the way patience is practical when haste has already broken enough. If there's a through line from the first carved footprint to the last bricked arch, it is care. Someone took the time to peck the outline of a thunderbird into a terrace that holds the morning light just so. Someone sank a shaft into a stubborn hill and cut timbers to keep it from closing on them. Someone shaped a pipe into a bird because smoke and story travel better when held by beauty. Someone gathered a person's bones and arranged them with intention, set them upright, because some meanings are easier to understand eye to eye. Someone stacked stone on a ridge not to impress us, But to serve a purpose, we are not entitled to explain cheaply. Someone laid brick into an arch underground because it was the best way, then left it to stand because the best ways often outlive their need. We arrive as latecomers, which is not a failing. It is a position. The job is to tread light, to test claims, to accept ambiguity when it is honest, and to keep the stories that deserve keeping. That means refusing to turn indigenous heritage into set dressing for an evening of chills. It also means not flattening the past into a museum label so sedate it loses pulse. It means understanding that unknown is not an empty box begging for our favorite theory. Sometimes it is a sign that says leave room. When a panel of petroglyphs reads like a language we can't parse, we can still learn the etiquette of listening. When a tunnel mouths open under a sidewalk, we can document and seal rather than pry for sport. When a ridge suggests a fort, and a calendar and a quarry all at once, we can let it be more than one thing or none of them without stripping it of wonder. Missouri keeps making the same offer. Walk with me. Do not rush. Learn what I have kept and why. In Washington State Park at first light, when the sandstone warms and the carvings darken, you can feel the deal being struck. In the Ozarks before noon, when fog lifts off an old log road and reveals a line of stone that holds no cattle, you can feel it too. On the Osage after a drought, when the river draws a new margin and shows you a little lesson in clay and carbon, the offer is there again. In a Gasconade field where an elder points to a rise and tells you not to plow deep, the offer includes an obligation. On a granite ridge above a park full of laughter, where silence feels intentional, it asks you to be small. And in a city basement where a hammer reveals an arch behind plaster, the offer arrives with a reminder. Curiosity without care is just another form of erasure. We will not solve all 9 mysteries. We should not. Some are not puzzles. They are places. Some are not questions. They are kin. The victory is not a theory that fits everything. It is a posture that fits the world. We actually have one that makes room for sacredness, for science, for stories that walk barefoot through cedar, and for records typed in a lab. For the kind of not knowing that makes you look closer rather than louder. The ground hums. Our work is to hear it, to answer softly, and to leave enough unsaid that the next person who listens can still be surprised. So we end where we began, ear to the stone, eyes on the water, feet at the edge of a ridge that holds its counsel. Missouri was never empty. It is still speaking. If we are lucky and careful, and willing to let the land lead, we might learn a little of its language, the part that sounds like wind through oak, and river over riffle, and a chisel tapping a spiral into morning. The rest we leave to the rock,